Hello and welcome back to Sci-fi Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep the lights on and our team paid. If you enjoy the story today, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our writers and narrators can afford their living expenses and continue bringing these adventures to you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link down in the description and pinned comment. The dropship shuddered violently as it scraped against the dense, upper atmospheric layers of Xylar 9. Inside the dimly lit transport bay, the air was incredibly stale, thick with the acrid smell of burning ozone, overly processed recycled oxygen, and the pungent nervous pheromones of exactly 12 different alien species. The cold metal walls pressed inward, creating a suffocating sense of claustrophobia that only deepened as the heavy vessel descended toward the uncharted surface. Sitting quietly in the far corner, securely strapped into a heavy crash seat built for a much larger anatomy, was August Ballard. He was the sole human on board, a highly decorated botanist turned ruthless mercenary, and right now, the absolutely only crew member not shaking entirely out of their own skin. They were plummeting toward a world universally classified by the Galactic Council as a death planet, a lush but utterly lethal biosphere chosen specifically to host the single most grueling survival examination in the known galaxy. Commander Kalen stood at the very front of the shaking cabin, completely unfazed by the intense structural turbulence. Kalen was a hardened veteran officer of the Kale species, towering over the young recruits with a massive, bipedal frame covered entirely in thick, obsidian scales that clinked softly, like overlapping plates of heavy armor with every single movement. His four piercing reptilian eyes scanned the terrified squad. When he finally spoke, his voice was a chilling, mechanical rasp that violently cut through the low, steady hum of the ship engines. He reached forward and activated the central holoprojector. A harsh, blinding blue light flickered to life, illuminating the cramped transport bay with highly detailed, three-dimensional renderings of the local planetary flora. Kalen warned them with absolute zero empathy in his harsh tone, stating firmly that down on the surface of Xylar 9, there were absolutely no second chances. One microscopic misstep, one accidental brush against the wrong leaf, would undoubtedly result in a prolonged, agonizing, and highly gruesome demise. The holographic display shifted seamlessly, zooming in closely on a strange cluster of violently red, heavily spiked berries, pulsing slowly with an ominous, sickly inner glow. Kalen pointed a sharp clawed digit directly at the floating image. He identified the plant as the neuroinflammatory sac, explaining in graphic detail that inhaling a single microscopic spore from its glowing surface would instantly boil the victim nervous system alive within a matter of mere seconds. The blue projection then morphed fluidly into a twisted, gnarly tuber, dripping constantly with a sickly, glowing yellow fluid. He coldly called this one the piercing root, an indigenous plant so highly acidic it could effortlessly melt through standard-issue reinforced combat boots and rapidly dissolve bone marrow upon bare contact. The diverse alien recruits instinctively leaned far away from the floating holograms, as if the cold light itself could physically burn them, their collective breathing growing remarkably shallow and wildly erratic. From the dark back of the bay, a short, incredibly dry chuckle unexpectedly broke the heavy, suffocating silence. August shifted his body weight against the tight safety restraints. A lazy, unbothered smirk plastered vividly across his weathered face. He leaned forward slightly, squinting casually at the terrifying holographic projections of the absolute deadliest plants in the entire sector. "Sounds exactly like habanero peppers and fresh ginger," August muttered, his deep voice loud enough to clearly echo in the small, silent space. He calmly crossed his arms over his broad chest. Where I am from, people use that to marinate beef. The entire alien squad simultaneously turned their heads to stare wildly at him. The insectoid Zale aggressively clicked its sharp mandibles in pure, unadulterated horror. The aquatic Vespans blinked their transparent secondary eyelids, looking completely and utterly baffled. They stared at the fragile, seemingly soft-skinned earthling, as if his primitive brain had already been completely liquefied by the intense, atmospheric pressure of the descent. To them, he was an absolute lunatic, a desperately suicidal fool openly mocking the very biological reapers of this terrifying world. Commander Kalen violently flared his large nostrils, his heavy obsidian scales standing totally on end in a terrifying display of primal, aggressive authority. He marched heavily down the narrow metal aisle, looming menacingly over August. Kalen opened his massive jaws wide, fully preparing to issue a severe disciplinary sanction and perhaps violently strike the arrogant human for his blatant, inexcusable insubordination. But the crushing punishment never actually came. Before Kalen could utter a single angry syllable, the entire heavily armored ship jerked violently upward, as if it had suddenly hit an invisible, solid brick wall right in midair. A blinding, searing pulse of pure crimson energy erupted massively from the deep planetary surface below, tearing viciously through the thick cloud cover and slamming directly into the underbelly hull of the dropship. The catastrophic impact was entirely soundless. Yet it instantly fried every single sensitive circuit on board. The glowing blue holograms died instantly. The humming main engines whined pitifully, sputtered violently, and fell totally dead silent. The emergency overhead lights flared a violent, bleeding red for exactly 2 seconds before burning out completely, plunging the terrified cabin into absolute, suffocating darkness. Artificial gravity completely vanished for one terrifying, weightless second before violently and forcefully reasserting itself. The heavy dropship lost all forward momentum and violently tilted forward, rapidly entering a catastrophic, entirely uncontrolled freefall. Pure panic erupted instantly in the dark bay. Piercing screams in a dozen different alien languages furiously filled the suffocating air as the massive metallic vessel tore wildly through the thick, highly toxic cloud layer. Outside the cracked viewport, the endless, looming canopy of Xylar 9 rushed up aggressively to meet them, like a massive, jagged green jaw, ready to consume them whole. The primary navigation array was completely gone. The main rear thrusters were nothing but melted, useless slag. The central communication console violently sparked and completely shattered, permanently severing any remaining hope of contacting the heavily armed fleet currently orbiting millions of miles above them. As the ancient tree line finally swallowed the falling ship in a deafening, terrifying symphony of screaming, tearing metal and violently snapping timber, one single truth became terrifyingly clear to every soul on board. This was no longer a strictly controlled survival test. They were wildly tumbling headfirst into an actual, inescapable, living nightmare. The heavy atmospheric pressure of the green hell hit the survivors the exact moment they pushed open the mangled loading ramp. The air outside the pulverized hull tasted heavily of raw copper, decaying biomatter, and overwhelmingly thick humidity. Twisted, smoking metal groaned painfully as the heavily bruised squad members slowly dragged themselves from the fiery wreckage. The dense canopy above was so incredibly thick that it swallowed the sunlight entirely, casting the damp, steaming jungle floor in a sickly, bruised twilight that offered absolutely zero comfort. Commander Kalen, bleeding thick purple fluid from a deep gash over his primary eyes, immediately barked absolute martial law. "Seal your environmental suits right now," he roared, his raspy voice cracking slightly under the intense strain of the crash. "Double-check your micro-mesh joints. Keep your hands tightly against your chests. Nobody touches a single leaf, a single vine, or a single speck of dirt on this cursed ground. We are completely blind out here. Understood? But the surrounding jungle was actively hostile, behaving far less like a passive landscape and much more like a massive, breathing organism fiercely hungry for fresh meat. The environment reacted instantly to their uninvited presence. A young Lyran scout, still trembling violently from the catastrophic impact, stumbled clumsily backward while trying to secure his cracked helmet. His heavy, armored boot snapped a brittle, rotting log hidden beneath the thick moss. The sudden, sharp vibration disturbed a low-hanging cluster of the violently red flora they had just been warned about in the briefing. A massive, microscopic cloud of highly concentrated toxic spores puffed aggressively into the humid air, settling invisibly onto the scout's exposed wrist joint, where his protective suit had slightly torn during the violent descent. The biological reaction was instantaneous and completely horrifying. The Lyran let out a blood-curdling, ear-piercing shriek as his pale blue skin immediately blistered, bubbling up and turning a sickly black color within 3 seconds. Violent chemical burns ate rapidly through his flesh, dissolving his nerve endings and causing his entire nervous system to violently misfire. He collapsed heavily to the damp, spongy soil, his limbs thrashing and contorting in grotesque, bone-breaking spasms that sickened everyone watching. Complete panic surged wildly through the disorganized ranks. Kalen dropped heavily to his knees, beside the convulsing scout, frantically tearing through his badly damaged emergency kit with trembling, desperate claws. The commander was searching wildly for a neutralizing medical agent that simply did not exist anymore. His harsh military discipline melting rapidly under the sheer, unyielding brutality of the alien flora. A few feet away, entirely separated from the chaotic screaming and the frantic scrambling, August calmly knelt down in the toxic, glowing mud. The human mercenary reached down barehanded into a thick patch of strangely illuminated yellow soil and firmly grasped the leafy top of a gnarly, dripping tuber. With a single, smooth pull, he yanked it free, revealing the exact acidic specimen Kalen had explicitly stated would dissolve bone marrow upon bare contact. August casually wiped the glowing, supposedly corrosive dirt against the hardened thigh plate of his heavy armor. With a completely deadpan, thoroughly exhausted expression, he lifted the lethal root to his mouth and took a massive, wet bite. The loud, crisp crunch of the fibrous, ginger-like tuber echoed strangely and sharply over the Lyran's agonizing screams. August chewed slowly and thoughtfully, wiping a bit of the spicy, stinging juice from his chin, strictly using the sharp, familiar burn to clear the lingering crash fatigue from his brain. Kalen snapped his heavy head around, his 4 reptilian eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing terror as he watched the fragile earthling casually snack on planetary-grade biological weaponry to stay awake. That sheer, unadulterated terror, radiating powerfully from the commander, and the frantic squad instantly triggered a deadly chain reaction. The terrified alien species began violently sweating out their distinct, pungent fear pheromones in massive quantities. The acidic, sour tang of their collective panic rose thickly into the humid jungle canopy, broadcasting a massive, invisible dinner bell for miles in every direction. High above them, hidden perfectly in the tangled, shadowy branches of the ancient trees, something ancient and infinitely cruel stirred from its slumber. The shadow stalker did not roar to announce its presence. It did not snap a single branch. It moved with the absolute, terrifying silence of a falling leaf, a flawless apex predator equipped with natural, hyper-advanced active camouflage that bent the bruised light entirely around its massive, lethal frame. It tracked the overwhelming scent of alien terror directly down to the smoking crash site, zeroing in on the easiest prey. The ambush was nothing but a sudden, violent blur of violently displacing air. The invisible beast dropped straight from the high canopy, like a massive, falling stone. It slammed directly into Zale, pinning the unfortunate insectoid co-pilot firmly to the forest floor with the crushing force of a falling boulder. The rest of the squad only saw the heavy green ferns flatten mysteriously and heard the terrifying, wet tearing of Zale's armored exoskeleton. The invisible predator had absolutely no intention of delivering a quick, merciful death. From the shimmering, distorted pocket of space directly above Zale's head, a long, incredibly sharp barbed stinger, the exact size of a human forearm, violently materialized out of thin air. It plunged deep and viciously into the soft, unprotected tissue of Zale's exposed neck. A sickening, squelching pump echoed clearly through the small clearing before the beast instantly vanished back into the upper canopy, leaving behind absolutely nothing but rustling leaves in pure, concentrated horror. Zale gasped for air, his insectoid mandibles clicking frantically and loudly as he clutched desperately at his bleeding neck. But the true, visceral nightmare was only just beginning its grim work. A massive, unnatural bulge suddenly appeared right beneath the thin skin of his throat. The highly toxic parasite the beast had just injected was alive, and it was violently, aggressively hungry. The entire squad watched in paralyzed, utterly helpless revulsion as the terrifying lump began traveling rapidly downward, burrowing viciously through Zale's upper chest cavity. The co-pilot screamed in unimaginable, tear-inducing agony as the alien creature began systematically devouring his internal organs from the inside out, causing his body to jerk wildly against the dirt. Zale convulsed horribly, vomiting a thick stream of black, foul-smelling fluid onto the soil. Kalen slowly backed away, his large, heavily armored shoulders completely slumping in utter, devastating defeat. The commander let his empty medical bag drop silently into the mud. "There is absolutely nothing we can do," Kalen whispered, his raspy voice entirely devoid of any remaining hope. The main medical bay was completely destroyed in the crash. The parasite is already deeply embedded in your primary digestive tract. He is completely beyond saving. Commander Kalen slowly lowered his heavy head, the thick obsidian scales on his thick neck grinding together in a mournful, rhythmic clatter. The harsh, absolutely uncompromising survival doctrines of the Kale Marshall species dictated one singular, inescapable truth for this exact horrific scenario. When a fellow warrior was irreversibly compromised on a hostile battlefield, rapidly losing their internal organs to an incurable alien infestation and screaming in terminal, undignified agony, the absolute only honorable course of action remaining was immediate, clinical euthanasia. With a remarkably steady, entirely emotionless grip, the large commander reached down to his heavily armored hip and unholstered his standard-issue plasma sidearm. The weapon emitted a low, deadly hum as the energy cell charged, casting a cold, piercing blue glow over Zale. Kalen aimed the heavy barrel directly at the center of the suffering co-pilot's frantic, clicking mandibles, fully preparing to deliver the final, merciful strike to permanently end the gruesome torture. Before his claw could fully depress the sensitive firing mechanism, a sudden, violently fast blur of human motion slammed incredibly hard into his right arm. August shoved his entire shoulder directly into the massive alien, utilizing every single ounce of his dense Earth gravity muscle mass to completely unbalance the much larger commander. The heavy plasma pistol was instantly wrenched violently from Kalen's grip, clattering harmlessly away into the thick, dark mud. August kicked the weapon further aside, his eyes completely wild with an intense, furious urgency. He grabbed the front of Kalen's tactical vest, completely ignoring the sharp alien scales violently cutting into his bare palms. "Back the hell off," August roared, his deep voice slicing sharply through the chaotic jungle noise. "I can absolutely save him. I just need exactly 10 minutes, and you need to stay entirely out of my way, without waiting for a single word of approval or permission. August spun around and sprinted recklessly directly into the deepest, thickest cluster of the surrounding deadly underbrush. He dove head first, right into the exact patch of violently red flora that had just brutally melted their Lyran scout moments earlier. He ruthlessly tore massive handfuls of the glowing, heavily spiked, neuroinflammatory sacs right off their twisting vines, entirely unprotected. He crushed the violently toxic berries firmly between his bare, calloused fingers, completely ignoring the supposedly lethal biological dust heavily coating his skin. Next, he frantically ripped up massive, pungent bundles of a broad, dark green leaf that smelled overwhelmingly of violently concentrated garlic and burning sulfur. He sprinted quickly back to the crash site, his arms completely overflowing with what the rest of the galaxy considered to be weapons of mass biological destruction. August grabbed a heavily cracked, discarded flight helmet from the smoking debris field, quickly filled it to the brim with murky water from a nearby jungle spring, and shoved it directly over a fiercely burning piece of the ship's hot engine core. The water immediately began to boil furiously. He dumped the massive handfuls of crushed red berries, the highly acidic roots, and the foul-smelling leaves directly into the bubbling water. He grabbed a twisted piece of shrapnel and stirred the concoction violently, crushing the plant matter further until the water turned a violent, murky, glowing crimson color. Thick, violently pungent steam rapidly billowed up from the cracked helmet, carrying an incredibly sharp, eye-watering aroma that instantly made the nearby alien squad violently gag and scramble backward in pure terror. Kalen finally recovered his balance, his 4 reptilian eyes blazing with an unprecedented, murderous fury. He drew a long, vibrating combat blade from his back sheath, the high-frequency hum practically deafening in the heavy, humid air. He leveled the glowing weapon directly at the human's throat. "You are deliberately torturing a dying comrade," Kalen bellowed, his raspy voice shaking with absolute rage and sorrow. "You are actively brewing the deadliest known neurotoxins on this cursed planet to inflict maximum, completely unnecessary suffering. Step completely away from the pilot right now, Earthling, or I swear upon my ancestors, I will immediately sever your head from your shoulders." August completely and utterly ignored the incredibly lethal, vibrating blade hovering mere inches from his jugular vein. He did not even blink a single time. Instead, he grabbed the boiling, glowing red helmet full of the violently spicy soup, completely ignoring how the scalding metal viciously seared the thick skin of his palms. He threw his entire body weight directly over the thrashing, screaming insectoid. August firmly pinned Zale's upper torso down securely with his knees, grabbed the alien's wildly snapping mandibles with his left hand, and forcefully pried his throat completely open. "Swallow this, and do not choke," August yelled forcefully over the terrifying alien screams. With one swift, merciless motion, he poured the entire bowl of the boiling, incredibly toxic broth straight down Zale's completely unprotected esophagus. The immediate biological reaction was utterly terrifying to witness. Zale's entire exoskeleton instantly flared a violently bright, glowing red color. His alien body seized violently, his limbs locking rigidly straight, as if he had been struck by a massive bolt of raw planetary lightning. His mandibles snapped wide open, and an unearthly, guttural screech tore violently from his burning throat. Suddenly, Zale convulsed forward with incredible force and violently vomited. A massive, steaming torrent of the glowing red liquid erupted rapidly from his mouth, splashing heavily onto the humid jungle soil. But right in the very center of the boiling puddle, something thick, black, and incredibly hideous was thrashing wildly. It was the lethal parasite, The terrifying, worm-like creature was screeching in absolute, mind-shattering agony. As the supposedly toxic soup coated its slick skin, the parasite rapidly began to smoke, sizzle, and violently dissolve within 5 short seconds. The terrifying predator that had been happily eating Zale's internal organs shriveled up completely, melting rapidly into a harmless, foul-smelling black puddle right there on the dark jungle floor. A heavy, completely stunned silence aggressively descended upon the ruined crash site. Zale slumped backward heavily against the wet mud, his chest heaving violently. But he was no longer screaming in pain. The sickening, moving bulge in his throat was completely gone. The insectoid took one very long, incredibly deep, rattling breath, slowly opened his multifaceted eyes, and blinked in total, absolute confusion. He was miraculously, completely intact. The incredibly lethal concoction that August had forcefully administered had not harmed the alien tissue in the slightest. The biological truth of the situation was as darkly hilarious as it was completely terrifying. The deadly alien parasite was fundamentally highly sensitive to basic acids and intense chemical irritants. The capsaicin from the fiery berries and the allicin from the pungent leaves, chemical compounds that humans actively cultivated, routinely harvested, and gleefully used to season their casual weekend barbecue meals, functioned as a violently lethal, highly corrosive acid bath to the indigenous, flesh-eating parasites of Xylar 9. Commander Kalen slowly lowered his vibrating blade, his heavy jaw totally slack, staring completely dumbfounded at the smoking puddle of dead alien parasite. The entire squad of highly trained alien mercenaries looked up slowly at the sweating, dirty human casually holding an empty metal helmet. They no longer saw a fragile, primitive earthling. In their terrified, widely dilated eyes, August had just violently ascended to the absolute status of a terrifying, unfathomable god of survival, a completely unhinged monster who casually weaponized his own lunch to effortlessly conquer the invincible. The sickly, bruised twilight of Xylar 9 completely surrendered to a suffocating, pitch-black darkness that aggressively swallowed the ruined crash site. The dense, towering canopy above was so incredibly thick that it entirely blocked out the light of the 3 planetary moons, plunging the stranded survivors into absolute, terrifying blindness. The sudden drop in temperature was sharp and biting, but the true horror of the alien night was not the cold. The harsh, metallic stench of the dissolved, rapidly rotting parasite slowly drifted outward from the clearing, forcefully carried by the heavy, humid jungle breeze. That foul, bloody odor acted as a massive, invisible dinner bell, echoing for miles across the deadly landscape, deep within the tangled, unseen shadows. The thick underbrush began to rustle with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity. Low, bone-rattling growls heavily reverberated through the damp air, violently shaking the thick leaves. The jungle was completely alive, and it was fiercely hungry. The scent of fresh blood had successfully awakened hundreds of the vicious, invisible shadow stalkers. They were slowly, systematically surrounding the makeshift camp, entirely cutting off any impossible chance of escape. The heavily armed alien squad immediately fell into a state of total, paralyzing despair. The sheer, overwhelming number of the approaching predators absolutely shattered their remaining military discipline. Kalen gripped his vibrating blade tightly, but his massive, heavily scaled arms trembled uncontrollably. The aquatic Vespans huddled together, emitting high-pitched, mournful clicks as their smooth skin rapidly dried out from pure panic. This intense, collective terror triggered an incredibly fatal biological response. The entire squad began profusely sweating out massive, highly concentrated waves of their unique fear pheromones. The heavy, sour tang of alien panic flooded the small clearing, forcefully pushing through the humid air and practically drawing a brightly glowing target on their collective backs for the highly sensitive olfactory glands of the approaching beasts. August Ballard did not panic. The human mercenary stood completely still beside the smoking engine core, his eyes rapidly scanning the dark, shifting tree line. His highly trained tactical mind fiercely dissected the impossible situation, seeking any viable, logical loophole in the planetary food chain. He noticed something incredibly vital. The terrifying, invisible predators were actively snapping massive branches and crushing heavy rocks as they aggressively circled the camp. Yet they flawlessly, deliberately avoided touching the violently red, glowing bushes of the deadly neuroinflammatory sacs. They gave the highly acidic, glowing yellow patches of the piercing roots a remarkably wide berth. August firmly grasped the fundamental logic of the alien ecosystem. The massive beasts were indigenous animals governed by strictly ingrained biological instincts. They fundamentally recognized the unique chemical signatures of those specific plants as absolute instant death. They hunt entirely by smell, August suddenly announced, his deep voice remaining remarkably calm and completely steady despite the terrifying, echoing growls surrounding them. Right now, we smell exactly like a massive, terrified buffet. But if we can drastically alter our chemical output, if our bodies physically radiate the exact same defensive compounds as those deadly plants, we will become entirely invisible to their noses. We will smell like pure poison, without wasting a single precious second. August grabbed the largest, deeply curved metal panel he could safely pry from the destroyed ship console. He forcefully slammed it down directly over the violently hot, exposed plasma vents of the broken engine core, creating a massive, makeshift cooking wok. He frantically gathered every single remaining handful of the lethally glowing red berries. Massive, jagged chunks of the heavily acidic roots, and huge, thick bundles of the foul, sulfurous leaves. He dumped the entire toxic harvest directly onto the sizzling, violently hot metal, forcefully mashing them together with the heavy butt of a broken plasma rifle. Finally, he threw in their entire remaining supply of bland, tasteless emergency nutrient paste to forcefully bind the violent chemical compounds together. The resulting culinary mixture was an absolute, terrifying weapon. Thick, violently pungent fumes aggressively billowed upward, violently burning the eyes and throat of anyone standing within 10 feet. It was essentially weaponized, highly concentrated tear gas masquerading as a deeply questionable stew. August firmly grabbed a long, jagged piece of metal, scooped up a massive, violently boiling portion of the red, glowing sludge, and turned fiercely to the paralyzed alien squad. "Listen to me very carefully," August roared, completely drowning out the terrifying growls of the approaching pack. "Every single one of you must eat a massive portion of this, right now, if you want to live to see the sunrise." The alien soldiers stared in absolute, unadulterated horror at the bubbling, violently steaming pile of supposed neurotoxins. Kalen looked from the terrifying human to the dark, rustling shadows creeping steadily closer. The commander heavily stepped forward, firmly grasped a massive handful of the violently hot mixture, and shoved it directly into his large, reptilian jaws. The tragicomic scene that immediately followed was a spectacular display of absolute biological torture. Kalen let out a massive, wet gasp, his 4 eyes rapidly welling up with thick, purple tears as his heavily armored scales flushed a bright, dangerous crimson. The Lyrans tentatively tasted the food and instantly collapsed to their knees, sneezing violently and uncontrollably as their internal body temperatures spiked dangerously high. The insectoid Zale clutched his head, his mandibles vibrating frantically as the intense heat aggressively popped his internal eardrums. They were forcefully experiencing the absolute, unforgiving peak of Earth culinary masochism. They sat in the dark mud, openly weeping, violently sweating out massive buckets of fluid, their sinuses forcefully draining, completely unable to process the violently tearing sensation, violently ripping across their sensitive alien tongues. But the brutal, incredibly painful strategy was already aggressively working. The highly concentrated capsaicin from the fiery berries and the intense allicin from the pungent roots were rapidly absorbed directly into their alien bloodstreams. The extreme chemical compounds violently forced their way out through the squad's heavily open pores, completely overriding their sour fear pheromones with an overwhelmingly thick, suffocating aura of violently extreme spice. The dark shadows finally peeled back. Dozens of massive, shimmering distortions in the air rapidly materialized into the terrifying, multi-limbed forms of the Shadow Stalkers. They lunged fiercely forward into the clearing, their massive, razor-filled jaws unhinged wide, fully ready to brutally slaughter the terrified prey. But right in mid-leap, the lead predator violently slammed into the invisible, heavily spiced biological wall, radiating from the profusely sweating squad. The massive beast suddenly stopped dead in its tracks, its eyes rolling back wildly. It gagged violently, producing a pathetic, high-pitched wheezing sound that completely betrayed its terrifying appearance. Its highly evolved, incredibly sensitive olfactory glands were violently overloaded, completely blinded, and deeply burned by the microscopic, weaponized capsaicin heavily hanging in the humid air. The monster sneezed aggressively, violently rubbed its massive snout deep into the dirt to escape the burning pain, and frantically scrambled backward in pure, unadulterated disgust. The rest of the terrifying pack immediately followed suit, whining pitifully as they forcefully retreated deep back into the dark jungle. The human had successfully saved them all, keeping them entirely alive by forcing them to become the absolute worst-tasting, most aggressively unpalatable dish on the entire planet. For exactly 3 grueling, agonizing days, the heavily battered survivors methodically dragged their exhausted bodies through the relentlessly hostile, fiercely overgrown environment of the Green Hell. Their desperate, completely agonizing biological gamble had miraculously held strong. The incredibly pungent, highly concentrated scent armor, aggressively seeping from their fiercely burning pores, acted as an impenetrable, invisible shield against the endless, terrifying hordes of unseen predators actively stalking them from the dense, humid shadows. Finally, after forcefully pushing their physical endurance far beyond any known organic limits, the dense, suffocating foliage abruptly broke apart, forcefully revealing their highly anticipated designated extraction coordinates. Looming heavily in the thick, intensely bruised twilight was an incredibly massive, long-abandoned ancient outpost. The colossal stone structures were heavily overgrown with aggressively pulsating, thick black vines, standing as a grim, perfectly silent monument to a completely forgotten galactic era. However, as the exhausted squad cautiously stepped into the massive, severely overgrown central courtyard, the deeply terrifying truth behind their catastrophic crash became instantly, chillingly clear. The towering, ancient planetary defense cannons heavily mounted on the high perimeter walls had not simply randomly malfunctioned. They had been deliberately, systematically rewired and forcefully integrated into an incredibly massive, highly intelligent biological network. The entire abandoned alien outpost had been violently and completely repurposed. It was absolutely no longer a forgotten military installation. It was the central, sprawling nesting ground for the absolute, terrifying apex predator, reigning supremely over the entire planetary sector. They had blindly walked directly into the undisputed domain of the Spore Queen. The solid stone ground beneath their heavy combat boots began to violently heave and aggressively shake. From the dark, highly cavernous depths of the primary central control spire, the Spore Queen slowly, majestically emerged, her colossal, horrifying form completely blocking the absolute, only viable path to the towering, heavily rusted communication antenna. She was an absolute gargantuan monstrosity, easily the exact size of a heavy galactic cruiser, composed entirely of heavily interwoven, hardened biochitin, fiercely glowing acid veins, and massively pulsating, highly toxic spore sacs. Her alien intelligence was deeply ancient and palpably, overwhelmingly malevolent. The mild, highly spicy sweat that had successfully kept the lesser jungle beasts entirely at bay meant absolutely nothing to her highly evolved, completely dominant biology. Her incredibly complex respiratory system possessed a heavily filtered, practically impenetrable biological armor that effortlessly and instantly neutralized their pungent defensive odor. Recognizing the immediate, overwhelming threat, Commander Kalen let out a massively defiant, deeply roaring battle cry. He bravely charged fiercely forward, gripping his violently humming plasma blade tightly, desperately attempting to draw her massive, terrifying attention entirely away from his deeply terrified squad. The massive queen barely even registered his courageous, suicidal attack. With one terrifyingly swift, utterly effortless swipe of her colossal, scythe-like front appendage, she viciously swatted the heavily armored commander aside like a fragile, totally insignificant insect. Kalen flew forcefully through the heavy, incredibly humid air, crashing brutally through a thick, ancient stone wall in a massive explosion of gray dust and shattered rubble. The fragile defensive formation of the alien squad instantly and violently shattered. The thoroughly terrified survivors scattered wildly into the dark, heavily crumbling ruins. Their heavy tactical plasma rifles were completely drained of energy, aggressively clicking uselessly against the overwhelming, suffocating silence of impending death. They were completely out of ammunition, entirely out of physical energy, and completely out of viable options. Kalen lay heavily pinned beneath several massive, fiercely crushing stone blocks, thick purple blood aggressively pouring rapidly from his deeply crushed chest plate. He coughed violently, fighting intensely to forcefully lock his four rapidly dimming alien eyes onto the human mercenary, cautiously approaching his heavily ruined position. "Run away, Earthling!" Kalen gasped forcefully, his harsh, intensely authoritative voice completely reduced to a wet, deeply desperate whisper. "Get deep into the thick jungle. Do not look back. There is absolutely no winning here. It is entirely over for us." The incredibly suffocating, physically crushing weight of absolute, cosmic despair heavily crashed down upon the ruined stone courtyard, practically extinguishing every single remaining spark of hope. August backed away very slowly from the dying commander, his broad chest heaving heavily as his highly trained eyes darted frantically across the pulverized, heavily shadowed stone. He desperately searched the grim, intensely hostile environment for any conceivable tactical advantage. Then, nestled deeply within the violently shattered remains of a massive, ancient primary generator housing, his eyes firmly locked onto something physically impossible. It was a massive, wildly overgrown, beautifully terrifying cluster of incredibly vibrant, bruised red vegetation. The strange, heavily spiked plants aggressively pulsed with a deeply unnatural, violently intense inner light, forcefully illuminating the surrounding wreckage. According to the highly classified, deeply terrifying botanical hazard files Kalen had explicitly shared during their initial orbital briefing, this specific flora was the absolute, undeniable zenith of Xylar 9's fiercely lethal ecosystem. The blood bloom of doom. It was highly classified by the Supreme Galactic Council as an apocalyptic, absolute planetary-level weapon of mass biological destruction. The official, thoroughly terrifying warning, strictly and clearly stated that inhaling even a microscopic fraction of the heavily glowing dust from its massive petals would completely, violently, and irreversibly dissolve the lungs of any carbon-based life form within exactly 3 seconds. But August Ballard was absolutely not just a hardened, fiercely ruthless mercenary. He was fundamentally a highly educated, deeply experienced earth botanist. He stood completely still in the dark ruins, intensely staring at the thick, wildly glowing red resin, actively dripping heavily from the bruised, massive oversized petals. His highly trained, deeply analytical mind rapidly broke down the intensely complex, supposedly invincible alien biology into basic, fundamentally understandable chemical structures. He deeply recognized the incredibly sharp, aggressively violent vapor actively distorting the humid air directly above the massive glowing flower. It was absolutely not a magical, entirely unstoppable alien acid. It was something deeply familiar, yet heavily scaled up to an absolutely terrifying, insane planetary extreme. It was the absolute, most incredibly concentrated, pristine, natural crystallization of pure capsaicin, violently and aggressively crossed with an unimaginably dense, deeply freezing menthol compound. It was essentially the exact botanical and precise genetic equivalent of a human ghost pepper, forcefully multiplied by exactly 10,000 times, violently mixed together with the absolute maximum strength of actively boiling peppermint oil. The entire terrified galactic community looked at this heavily glowing plant and saw an incredibly complex, completely unstoppable biological weapon of sheer, absolute world-ending terror. August Ballard slowly curled his heavily bruised, dirty hands into incredibly tight fists. He firmly locked his fierce, completely unyielding gaze onto the heavily glowing red petals, and exclusively saw an immensely powerful, aggressively spicy, incredibly massive seasoning packet entirely ready to be forcefully utilized. In an act of sheer, unparalleled biological insanity, August Ballard forcefully unbuckled the heavy magnetic clasps of his protective chest plate. He aggressively ripped off his heavy tactical vest, completely discarding his remaining body armor until his upper torso was entirely exposed to the humid, highly toxic air of the alien ruins. Without a single moment of hesitation, the human mercenary threw his entire body forward, diving directly into the massively overgrown, fiercely glowing center of the blood bloom of doom. He wrapped his bare, highly bruised arms tightly around the colossal cluster of the deadliest vegetation in the known galaxy. With a primal, deeply guttural shout, he forcefully crushed the massive, fiercely glowing petals straight against his own chest. He deliberately, wildly smeared the thick, violently red, intensely glowing toxic resin all over his exposed skin, rapidly painting himself from head to toe in the absolute zenith of planetary poison. He reached deep into the violently burning brush and firmly gripped two incredibly thick, jagged branches that were absolutely dripping with the hyper-concentrated, intensely spicy sap. The immediate, overwhelming physical reaction should have been instant, agonizing death. The sheer, mind-shattering pain of the extreme capsaicin and highly concentrated menthol cocktail violently hitting his bare flesh was unimaginably intense, rapidly setting every single nerve ending in his body entirely on fire. Yet, the uniquely resilient human endocrine system recognized the massive, catastrophic pain and instantly countered it with a supreme, unmatched biological defense. August's internal organs violently flooded his rapid bloodstream with massive, unprecedented tidal waves of heavy endorphins and raw, explosive adrenaline. His pupils dilated entirely. His rapidly pounding heart forcefully pumped the potent chemical cocktail through his veins, temporarily transforming the agonizing external burn into an absolute, intoxicating frenzy of pure, unstoppable physical power. August let out an incredibly feral, deeply terrifying roar that forcefully echoed across the pulverized stone courtyard, entirely drowning out the ambient jungle noise. Tightly gripping the two heavily coated, violently glowing branches like twin flaming swords, he charged directly, fearlessly at the colossal Spore Queen. The gargantuan alien monstrosity practically paused in pure, unadulterated confusion. Her highly advanced, deeply ancient intellect could not possibly comprehend why this incredibly tiny, entirely fragile pink creature was aggressively running toward her instead of fleeing in absolute terror. Recognizing the immediate, charging threat, the Spore Queen reared her massive, heavily armored head backward. She wildly unhinged her massive, horrifying jaws, completely revealing rows of razor-sharp, incredibly long biochitin teeth, fully intending to easily swallow the screaming human entirely whole. At the exact, precise moment, she violently lunged downward to snap her massive jaws shut. August aggressively slid forcefully across the deeply cracked stone floor. He violently thrust both of his heavily coated, intensely glowing red branches straight upward with every single ounce of his adrenaline-fueled strength. He viciously drove the fiercely glowing, intensely spicy wood deeply and forcefully right into her massive, unprotected orbital sockets, while simultaneously plunging the second jagged branch directly down into the soft, highly vulnerable, aggressively pulsating pink tissue of her completely exposed inner throat. An absolute, instantly catastrophic, sensory overload aggressively detonated deep within the colossal queen. Her highly advanced, profoundly sensitive alien nervous system completely and violently short-circuited against the sudden, violently explosive introduction of the supreme supercapsaicin. The sheer, unfathomable shock of the intensely burning, rapidly freezing botanical weapon, forcefully overwhelming her internal receptors, was absolutely devastating. The gargantuan monster emitted a world-shattering, incredibly high-pitched, ear-bleeding scream that violently cracked the remaining ancient stone pillars surrounding the courtyard. She violently convulsed, wildly and aggressively thrashing her massive body around the ruined outpost, in a desperate, entirely futile attempt to physically escape the invisible, consuming internal fire, violently burning her brain. The queen aggressively began tearing her own hardened biochitin scales right off her colossal body. Her massive, heavily armored limbs twisted into unnatural, highly broken angles. Within exactly 45 seconds, the absolute, undisputed apex predator of Xylar 9 violently collapsed heavily to the pulverized stone, rapidly succumbing to massive, catastrophic anaphylactic shock and total, highly violent asphyxiation. A massive cloud of gray dust forcefully plumed upward as the enormous beast finally stopped moving entirely. A few feet away, August heavily collapsed directly onto his knees. His entirely red, heavily blistering skin was visibly smoking in the thick, humid air, radiating an incredibly intense, eye-watering heat. Yet, as he looked up at the colossal, highly dead alien monster, a remarkably wide, utterly satisfied smile was firmly plastered right across his exhausted face. Exactly 4 hours later, the heavy atmosphere above the dark jungle violently tore open. A heavily armed, highly advanced galactic rescue fleet had finally pinpointed the faint, heavily distorted distress beacon from the crashed dropship. Dozens of heavily armored, intensely glowing rescue vessels forcefully descended from the sky, landing heavily right in the exact center of the ruined ancient outpost. The heavy loading ramps violently smashed down against the stone. Hundreds of elite, heavily armored shock troopers aggressively flooded out into the dark courtyard, their heavy plasma rifles raised high and fully charged. They swept the area with highly intense, piercing tactical lights, completely and utterly expecting to find absolutely nothing but brutally scattered, half-chewed bones and the grim, highly tragic remains of a completely failed survival exam. Instead, the highly trained rescue squad entirely froze in their heavy tracks, their jaws forcefully dropping open. Several elite troopers literally dropped their heavy weapons, the heavy metal clattering loudly and sharply against the stone floor in pure, unadulterated shock. Directly in the exact center of the massive courtyard, Commander Kalen and the heavily battered, highly exhausted alien squad were comfortably gathered around a massive, brightly roaring, heavily crackling bonfire. They were absolutely not dead. They were cheerfully and loudly roasting incredibly massive, thickly cut, highly juicy slabs of prime alien meat that they had forcefully carved straight out from the colossal, heavily smoking corpse of the fallen Spore Queen. The incredibly pungent, highly mouth-watering aroma of heavily seared alien steak, fiercely seasoned with wild, aggressively spicy jungle herbs, completely filled the damp night air. Commander Kalen was sitting heavily on a broken stone pillar, casually holding a massive, violently dripping meat skewer, heavily marinated in the exact same leftover toxic leaves that had previously saved their lives. The massive alien commander took a huge, very confident, deeply aggressive bite of the perfectly charred meat. Thick, dark purple tears immediately streamed rapidly down his heavily scaled face from the incredibly intense, violently aggressive spice burning his alien tongue. Yet, despite the intense physical weeping, his expression was one of absolute, deeply profound, entirely unmatched culinary satisfaction. He slowly chewed the spicy meat, swallowed heavily, and looked calmly at the totally bewildered, highly paralyzed rescue team standing before him. Kalen confidently pointed his half-eaten skewer directly at the heavily armed soldiers and spoke with supreme, absolute authority. There is absolutely no biological barrier in this universe that is truly terrifying, except for the culinary palate of humanity. A few feet away from the roaring campfire, safely resting on a softly humming, gently hovering medical stretcher, lay August Ballard. His entire body was heavily wrapped completely, from his head to his toes, in thick, highly advanced white burn bandages, looking exactly like a heavily bruised, deeply exhausted mummy. The human mercenary slowly turned his heavily wrapped head toward the highly confused, deeply staring armored medics. He coughed weakly, a small puff of heavily spicy smoke escaping his dry lips. But he was grinning incredibly brightly beneath the thick medical gauze. Did anyone happen to bring any ice-cold beer? Thank you so much for tuning in and sincerely listening to our story today. We would genuinely love to know exactly where in the world you are currently listening from. So please kindly let us know down in the comments section. If you truly enjoyed this epic tale of human survival and think our content brings value to your day, please thoughtfully consider supporting our channel with a simple donation of just $1. You can easily and safely do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by using the convenient PayPal link provided down in the video description and the pinned comment. Your highly generous, deeply appreciated support goes directly to paying our incredibly dedicated staff, allowing them to comfortably feed their families, and strongly empowering us to continue creating even better, more thrilling science fiction stories, specifically to serve you. Have a truly wonderful day, and we will happily see you in the very next adventure.